Welcome everybody to our LinkedIn Live on the state of DEI, the contingent workforce for 2023. I'm excited. Today is going to be a very interesting conversation. A lot has changed. We have special guests, Anne Bookout, Global Head of Culture and Fulfillment at Impellum Group, Christina Severa, VP of Workforce Advisory at Hyrogenics, Cassandra Fair, Director of Global Partnerships and Center of Excellence at TapFin, Rebecca Perot, Global VP of Culture and Diversity at Magnet, Pam Sands, VP of Strategy and Partnerships, Diversity Officer at Kelly OCG, and then Dan Kubal, Director of Product Strategy and Platform Growth at Beeline. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Ashish Kaushal. I'm the CEO of a diversity staffing firm, Hire Talent and Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build belonging in the workplace. 2023 has been quite a year. Many things have happened here impacting the DEI landscape, from the affirmative action rulings to the number of growing diversity officers leaving their companies. A lot of them are my friends. It's time to go from intent to action when it comes to DEI initiatives and truly focus on building inclusion of all workers, specifically contingent workers such as contractors, freelancers, and temp workers. We've kind of always kept them separate from what we call direct hire. And I think ultimately in an organization, culture gets impacted by everybody, not just a segment of your workforce population. So for those of you who've seen all the policies that politicians are trying to roll back, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. As a society, the demographics are changing. This is the first time in our history in the US where we're all minorities. There's no majority population. So it's time that we now take action and move from policy and talk into action. When I started Consciously Unbiased, the premise was to focus on our commonalities rather than our differences. It's about inclusion. It's not about me, it's about we. It's about microprogressions to change. We have to not try and hit things out of the park when it comes to DEI. Change happens through a series of small habits that happen over time, which really changes the culture and the DNA in an organization. So let's be smart about how we tackle this. Bottom line is we have to make sure that supplier diversity is here to remain, and we have to stop voting against ourselves, stop polarizing, and stop fighting yesterday's battles. It's about competitiveness as organizations. And as you can see, even with the laws that are attempting to change, corporate America is on track to double their inclusion training spend in the next 3 years because they know what's needed to stay relevant and competitive. The time for marketing diversity is past. It's time to follow through and say what we're going to do and measure it just like any other business initiative. So I think the area where we really missed on was we used diversity as sort of a marketing tool, and we've used it as the right thing to do, but we haven't tied it in directly into how does it help your business profitability. And businesses are ultimately in the business of making money. So we have some amazing leaders here today to talk about how to make DEI a reality. I'm just going to say a disclaimer. I know that I mentioned everyone and their titles and their companies, but today's viewpoints are going to be their own. So we're probably going to get deep and raw a little bit. And so I just want to make sure everyone's aware that they're not representing their companies in this discussion today. Vishali, welcome. Okay, so now that I've started off with that long-winded, passionate view that I have on diversity and inclusion, let's start off with the element in the room. DEI is getting a lot of backlash in 2023, with many people saying DEI is deepening the divides rather than building bridges. I think the key solution is to focus on inclusion and helping employees find commonalities. What do you think are the most effective ways companies can keep pushing inclusion efforts forward despite the recent backlash? And I'd love to start with you, Anne.
Well, thanks for kicking off with me. And I think we've had some prep conversations around this, and I'm really keen to hear what my colleagues think here. And I think one of the biggest things is it starts from the top. I think we were talking yesterday with Pam, and I were discussing around how things can start at a grassroots level. And I think that's really important, hearing the people on the ground that are living day in, day out the employee experience. A lot of great energy and great ideas and change starts with them. But at the end of the day, if you don't have senior leaders that are willing to give each of us a seat at the table and an active seat at the table, it's very, very difficult to drive that momentum around some of these bigger changes, especially the headwinds that many of us are facing in the changing environment. I think the other big thing is that companies have to understand and communicate what their values are. So my personal values may be different than what the company is able to or interested in standing for. But at the end of the day, we have to align as a leadership team on what are the values of the organization. And then it makes things much easier when the landscape changes, no matter what happens in the landscape. When you know what your core values are, it's much more simple to stay on track and stay on path. And I'll give an example from Impellum. When Roe versus Wade was overturned last year, which I know is a difficult and controversial topic for many, we were very quick to respond. We have about 2/3 of our workforce is women globally. We were very quick to respond to say we support women, and we will continue to invest in policies and benefits that will support people that have to have the access that they need for their reproductive rights. And so we've done a lot of work with our benefits teams, our legal teams, et cetera, to make sure we understand what can we do for our people. And we were very quick to roll that out and to be able to support people. And so when we had that as a core value, and we had the top leadership, along with myself, voicing the needs to take a stand on this, it wasn't really a question. It came through quite easily. Now there's other topics that are more difficult, but I do think those two things go hand in hand: the leadership alignment and commitment to the values, and it starts all the way at the top.
Absolutely. I love that you guys took a stand on that too. I had I had written an article around that, and I wrote it in a way that, like, we're already polarized, where half people feel one way, half the people feel the other way. And so I wrote it in a way that I think you're either going to love what I wrote, or you're going to hate what I wrote, but it's probably more 100% in one direction or the other. So at least it brought people together in that sense.
I think that's probably others can echo this. Anybody in this work can say that either you're going to make half the people really happy and really piss off the other half of the people, and you have to sort of be okay with living with that. And it may be different people on different days. So it's all good.
Absolutely. Christina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I agree with everything Anne said. The only thing I'll add to it is that I think, it does start at the leadership level, and that, like, leading by example, which also to me means that they're making inclusive policies, but also having a diverse leadership team. We know that having a diverse stakeholder group and hiring community means that they're going to hire diverse folks also, so that, you're continuing to have that diversity of thought to bring the innovation to the organization. But so not only having the leaders kind of like live and breathe the message and the culture, but also being like inclusive and diverse themselves, so that the community of the workforce that they're looking for is represented at that leadership level.
Absolutely. And Cassandra?
There's not much more to add to my colleagues. I always use the adage, it's easier to roll the boulder down the hill than it is to roll the boulder up the hill. Right. So I co-sign with Anne that it does have to start with the top down. There has to be a homogenous message throughout the organization, everyone speaking the same language, everyone understanding what it means to promote DE&I, right? And then having a plan as to how to implement it, and then what success ultimately looks like. And success does not always mean something contributed to the bottom line, but how the organization is moving and shifting culturally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Pam, I know you're going to throw some spice on this.
Yeah, so great thoughts by Anne, Christina, and Cassandra, as always. And I do agree that it starts at the top. We've talked about that. We've got to listen to our employees, because at the end of the day, in our work, talent is our greatest capability that we have, right? It is our specialty. But there's also a segment in here that I think is important as we talk about that. As I look at clients and look internally in other organizations, it's also the middle management factor. And is that transcending from leadership to middle management? How is that being looked at? How is it being addressed? And is middle management hearing both sides of that conversation? And I think as we think about the conversations which we should be having, we've really focused over the last few years about the what needs to happen with DE&I, what needs to happen with what's going on with rulings and advocacy. But we really need to bump ourselves up even above values to looking at the why. Why are we doing this? Let the why help us then look at what we need to do, how we need to do it, and who, and bring it back to some basics. Because I think what we're hearing from talent today is there's been a lot of good marketing messaging out there, but what is the impact that we're really having, and how are they feeling that impact?
I know, absolutely. And Rebecca?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, and I think every single thing that's been mentioned is such important elements. And as each of you spoke, it's like, oh yes, an added element to this. The only thing that I would add is looking at this as a business imperative. So it gets into that why, right? And it gets into all of these aspects that you all mentioned, but really approaching this as you would any other business need. So you do look at the why, you look at the root causes, you look at the strengths, the opportunities, you look at the data as a foundation, and you have data, which could be a missing hole for a lot of organizations. And you use all of that to create your plan that you mentioned, Pam. And you approach it in this very methodical way that we've approached business needs for decades, for centuries. And this should be no different. And of course, there's this cultural element as well, but it's such a needed critical component of success in our world that it needs to be approached in that way. And then with that strategy, with your goals, with your KPIs and the actions associated with those, there needs to be accountability, right? Yeah. So that it's not just we've checked these boxes for our marketing goals and the performative statements. It's going farther to say what has actually changed, and what we said needed to change, did it change? And if it didn't, why didn't it change? Who needs to be accountable? What processes need to change so that we actually start making progress in the right direction? And I will say, I have seen some organizations start to do this. So we're not, sometimes it can get very easily to get discouraged. Like, we haven't gone anywhere. People are just saying things and we haven't made change. And although it's very, very slow, progress in the right direction is getting us there, because cultural change, both societal and organizational, takes time. And so we have to be just moving in the right direction and celebrating those small wins while recognizing the long road we have ahead of us.
I think a lot of what I'm hearing from all you guys is basically we have to go from marketing to measuring, and then from there to implementing. Vishali, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Ashish, and thanks everyone. I think you guys really painted a really robust picture of a lot of the things that go into the work. So thank you. That makes my job easier or harder to go last. But I think that one thing that has shown me in many of my experiences within my organization, as well as with several clients, is when leadership keeps it real. So a lot of things that leaders are saying, that we're saying, that well-meaning people in the industry are saying, can sometimes be just rhetoric. It's like, we've been hearing this. It's been going on for a long time. So when leaders who are influential in the organizations and in the industry are keeping it real, talking about things that maybe they don't quite fully understand, maybe things that they thought would work and didn't work, maybe pivoting as needed because things happen in our worlds and we need to keep making some changes as we do in business and everything else. So just keeping that really real has shown a lot of impact. And I think one of you mentioned, like, the middle management is so important. The talent is so important. I mean, they don't just listen to the right message that they hear every time. They listen to a lot more underneath that. And I think when leaders keep it real, they show their vulnerabilities. I myself in many sessions will say, I'm sorry, I don't understand this aspect. Can we talk a little bit more about this? Just because I have this title or this role or this amount of experience doesn't mean that I fully understand every aspect or everyone's perspective. So I think that is another really important thing. And I think for a period of time, we as practitioners seem to have overlooked that. We learned all the right things to do, to plan, to say, to read, but we forgot that, there are these other aspects that other people have that aren't understood or that aren't answered. Let's also take that upon ourselves to bring that up. So that's the only thing.
Absolutely. And so creating a platform and a venue that people can be heard as well. Dan, I'm going to end it with you on this question, but I'm going to add in what Latanya Jackson's asked. Why is DEI, what impact is DEI having, and why do many feel like it's not having much of an impact from a corporate perspective? So if you want to take that on, you can add that to this question.
I'll wrap up the last question real quickly though and say everyone said a lot of things around what we could do. I think one of the things that I think about when it comes to D&I, maybe you wouldn't like this visual, but this is what I have, right? the squeaky wheel gets the oil. A lot of people say that. So when you hear a wheel squeaking, the louder it squeaks, the more oil it's going to get. But in a way, if companies have that squeaky wheel, which is one of the squeaky wheels could be, we need to improve our diversity. There's probably a lot of competing priorities, and that's probably why the D&I things aren't moving as fast as possible. And, there's many dimensions to a business. So I can appreciate that the squeaky wheel of D&I may not get the oil right away. But I think what we have to do is recognize companies have made the statements to address it. That's companies making D&I statements and saying, we intend on doing this. There are competing priorities. I think getting a company to understand where they are today in the D&I voyage is the first part. How do you set priorities? Because I think running a business is all about priorities. What do I need to do now to keep my business moving? If companies can understand the importance of D&I and creating an inclusive environment, which has a lot of downstream values, right? Which is, it makes you a better place to work. It makes your company reputation better. It just provides more output. It's shown that more diverse companies have better outputs. So it's like thinking about where companies are today is one thing I think is missing, to be honest. It's one thing to go out there at a top level and say, like, I agree that the pushing a boulder down the hill is faster. So the message needs to start from the top, but do the people at the top even know where the company is from that perspective? And I think that's maybe a gap. So I would say one thing that's holding us back is understanding where you are today. There could be companies that are really good champions of D&I and doing a good job of D&I. Those people should be out there talking about not just the intention, but their success, to lead other to follow and to show people there's a goal and that it can be accomplished. So it's like breaking down the barriers is almost like a mental game of what's the priority, and then do I need to do this now, and what's the value for it, and then how hard is it? Like, show people that it can be easier. Maybe it is hard, and then come up with micro steps to get over those boulders. So that's my take on it.
No, I agree. Definitely baselining. You can't fix something if you don't know where you stand today. And so I think baselining is really important and self-reflecting. How do we make DI more comfortable to speak about within organizations so it's not as polarizing? Because I feel like the D and the E have kind of gotten polarized in the last few years. Whereas, and I've always said we have to focus on the I first and get the inclusion policies right if you want the D and E to work at all. But what are your thoughts on how to make it more comfortable to even discuss in this environment?
So I think the one way to make it more comfortable, and the word comfort is so interesting, right? It's not everything's comfortable. Some things that you have to do are uncomfortable. You have a cavity, you got to fill it. It's an uncomfortable experience, but you'll be better in the long term, right? So I feel like breaking down the barriers of or helping to make it more of a comfortable discussion may not be the goal. It may be more making it understandable, which should lead to comfort, right? When I understand something, I'm more likely to go through it in a positive way versus if I'm confused or don't understand it, I'm more likely to be apprehensive and less willing to go through and just go through the voyage. So I think D&I, maybe it's about talking about just human and talking about people's differences and less about the word diversity can be polarizing. I recognize that. And obviously society has, we have a very polarized world we live in today, in my opinion. Maybe just talking about good things that humans can do for each other or being nice to each other, creating that environment of comfort and understanding and sort of, humbleness to others or appreciation to others, accommodating people's differences in terms of how they live, work, again, talking about just different cultures and things that people bring into the workforce, not celebrating it necessarily, making a big deal about it, just being like, yeah, that's that person that represents them. I'm cool with it. We don't need to go put it on a billboard and say, look how this is so great. It's more like everyone's different, just embrace it. And I think that would be one of the ways to make it less of you have to be a diversity champion to be all about D&I. I don't think you have to be all about D&I to be a contributor. You just have to be a good person, willing to appreciate people's differences. Start from there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to add to that?
I'm just going to say one thing to add to what Dan just said, which is to make it a little less prescriptive. Let's not tell people how to think and what to do. Sometimes, yes, what they're doing isn't quite productive and isn't helping the culture. And a involved question. Let's include them in the solution rather than being the prescription, which we tend to do sometimes. We want to move quickly, or we want to just bring everybody along and say this is how we see this done. Rather than that, let's ask them. Then they've got a reason for maybe not being part of the solution so far. So how can we bring them along? And I think that goes back to the intention. And I think most people have at the bottom good intentions. It's just that they're not seeing what's happening in line with what their intentions are. But let's find those common grounds. And I think that helps sometimes to make that uncomfortable piece a little bit more comfortable. I think it's a cultural thing. And I think, as Rebecca said, I mean, it takes time, especially if you are an organization where there is, a history of more diversions or more polarizations. I mean, that's going to take a little different approach than another organization where, you more or less have views that are aligned. And then there's just a little bit more that needs to be moved along the curve. So I think, again, a more custom approach there based on the culture is the way to look at it.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think it's like fostering that curiosity and allowing people to have really open conversations about what they don't understand today and how they want to broaden their awareness of different cultures or neurodivergent coworkers or LGBT community members, whatever it might be. I know we've talked about almost having like a human library. We've heard about this. I can't remember what is it in Sweden, where you can like go and kind of check out a person to get to know more about their experiences as a human being, and kind of having that in the workplace. And so that you can kind of say, hey, I want to get to know more about, autism. And I know my coworker is either autistic or has a child. And, then you can kind of schedule time with a volunteer that's willing to share their experiences and foster that curiosity amongst team members. So something that we're actually playing with now to really think about how do we inspire that curiosity and bring human beings together to learn more about each other.
One thing or a couple things I was going to add. So, one, Dan, I hear your point about the squeaky wheel, and I don't disagree. I think it has to be persistent coming from DEI leaders. But it also, one of the ways that I define success is when someone who's doesn't have DEI in their title or culture or people or whatever in their title, when a business leader comes forward and brings an idea about diversity to the conversation without being prompted. And that's where I think when we talk about, one of the examples I can think of is we had a big event back in June, and our CEO said, we have to acknowledge Pride Month at the top of this, right? Like we can't. And I'm like, absolutely. And the fact that I didn't have to say, oh, it's Pride Month, and it's not that, oh, we should only celebrate this in June or we should only talk about it at this point in time. But I just think when you hear that you're creating space for others to bring forth the diversity, and you're hearing without having to be the squeaky wheel all the time, I feel that is one of the ways that we can define success in one of those maybe not so quite measurable ways. And so I was really proud of that moment. But I also think that when you were thinking about a couple of other people said about diverse voices in the room, diverse voices are also people that you disagree with, and that's okay. I remember having a conversation with someone as we're anticipating, again, going back to the Roe versus Wade overturning. I asked this person who I thought wasn't quite sure what their perspective was. And I said, well, what do you think about this decision? And then what they shared with me, I didn't agree with, but it helped me understand more where people were coming from. And I think we have to not be so defensive when we hear things that maybe don't align with our personal values or even the values of the organization, because if we don't, you do end up alienating potentially 50% of the people if you're only opening the voices to the conversation to the people who share the same values as you. Another example of this was a few years ago during the 2020 election. And there's so much division, and it was coming into the workplace. There was so much going on during that. It was such a political hotbed. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is people called me actually afterwards, and they're like, I typically vote Republican, and I'm afraid to say that. And I was like, well, that's not okay either. It might be something I disagree with, or maybe it's a little culturally different than what the organization may typically stand for. But I don't know. We're not a political organization, and I don't think it's right for anyone to actually have that fear of sharing something, even if it's just something I disagree with. And of course, there always has to be a line. There's always things that are unacceptable, and you have to be really clear about that. But we have to be conscious that you don't want to be so prescriptive or so losing that human element that you're creating division in a way that is alienating half of your workforce or half of your candidate pool or half of your customers because you genuinely don't know where other people stand on these particularly hotbed issues that are coming up more and more.
No, absolutely. You reminded me of something I think I talked to Brian about last time I saw him, actually, is like if you look at our LinkedIn Live right now, there's 8 of us, right? And we all look different, but we have similar perspectives. And I think we really have to move from an organization of they're different than me to a different like me, because we're all different and we're all unique. And so if we get that's our commonality, that actually ties us all together. And so I think that's sort of the mental shift that has to happen with organizations to make this a more comfortable discussion. And probably the second thing is we're assuming that diversity is the people, they aren't as capable, or there's a disadvantage. And we're not saying hire the diverse person, we're saying hire the best person, which means include all the diverse people in that discussion. So it's still merit-based. And I think the merit-based part has also been left out of the picture, which we need to make sure that's highlighted, because that helps soften the argument and increases the argument of why this is needed in the organizations. What are some of the objectives that you guys are getting in DEI today, as opposed to last year or the previous years, in regard to contingent workforce? Anything?
Well, I'd say I'm still somewhat, it's reducing, so it's good. We're making progress, as we talked about before. But I do still get sometimes from clients that they're concerned about the legal aspects of collecting data. And we talked about knowing where you are, talked about using data as a foundation. So to not be able to collect information that actually takes a little while, could take up to a year, depending on size of programs and contingent worker populations at clients, could take a while to get meaningful metrics. So if we're still getting some pushback in that area, that just inhibits us from making some of this progress. Doesn't say we still can't do something, right? We can't still have a strategy, but it's not going to be quite as meaningful, or it might not be, if we don't have that data, right? If we don't know where we're starting, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, what we can work on, it's not going to be as impactful as it could be. So collecting that data, the legal aspects, just the unfamiliarity with it is still something that I get, but I take heart that it's decreasing, right? When we started this 2+ years ago, there was a lot more pushback than there is today.
So Rebecca, I mean, given like last year, basically the state of California is forcing both the clients, the suppliers to actually track this data and report it on a government level from an equal pace perspective. It's sort of broken the back of this co-employment risk issue that everyone's been afraid of to track this data. So if we're still not doing it, is it more because we're afraid of what we're going to see and we don't want to react to it? Or is the fact that law has been pushed out and sort of breaking the back around this argument that's just not, people aren't aware of it as much as they should be?
I think there's lots of different reasons for this, but one that I think is key is the lack of accountability. Because contingent workers don't necessarily, I mean, they're not employed by the clients, right? They are employed by a third party. It gives a lack of accountability of who does this fall under. And it's much easier for them to say, okay, suppliers can track this information. We can have hands off because of legal risks, because of concern of what they see, and for the priorities Dan discussed, right? There's so many priorities. Let's let suppliers do that. It's their employer anyways. We don't need to deal with that. And we need to say that who has the power in these situations? The clients have the power. The clients create a culture of inclusion. The clients are a big initiator on what pay is given, right? All of these aspects that are a piece of this, they ultimately make the hiring decisions, right? So all of these pieces that are necessary for who has the power is the client. So really, yes, we all that are on this call need to enable them, give them the tools, support them, but who makes that decision, who has the power? It is the client.
Ash, I want to jump in on that.
Sure. Oh, you're on mute.
Me, I'm not sure what that means. So there we go. But you mentioned something really important in this conversation, and so did you, Rebecca, right? Talking about where the power is, but also talking about what's happening at a state level and a legislative and a regulatory level. We've got to bump that up a little bit, because who really has the power in many of these conversations right now as well are global regulations that are happening around many of these topics, then how is that coming to your national level? What is that looking like at the state level? And it's really the time that we need to take a step back and look at what are the policies that are in place today? What are the policies that are looking to be put in place in the future? How does that align with larger initiatives like the UN Global Compact? How does it align around sustainable development goals? Who's leading the conversation? A lot of these conversations are being led in Europe and coming across the pond here and moving into the Asia Pacific region. We need to be more involved and active and looking for the ways that we partner to know more about what the regulations are that are happening, and not just respond to them. How do we influence them? How we are essential. The nature of work that we do is important. We provide people opportunities. We help them reskill. You can't divorce the conversation of the importance of work and people's quality of life. We've got to really look at that and say, how do we influence that power? How do we exercise that muscle ourselves, in my opinion? And then we come to, now, what does that mean to us in our industry? What does that mean to the people we employ, the clients that we work with? We've really got to influence that more and say, in some cases, enough is enough. This is not a political platform. We're talking about people in their lives.
I love that last part. Definitely. Are you seeing the programs, because you all represent basically probably the top 500 companies in the country, if not the world, in terms of clients and your mix of people. So you've had a broad aspect of or view of everything at this point. So are you finding that the companies that integrate their contingent workforce DI strategy with their direct hire DI strategies as a one cohesive solution are the ones that are being most effective in the implementation?
I think that's a really good segue question, Ashish, because I was just thinking about that as Pam and Rebecca were talking, because a couple of years ago, clients were not even looking at this workforce in the same way. And then over the last couple of years, I think they've slowly started to look at, where they can have influence, where they want to know the data a little bit better, where they want to influence. And I'd much rather have a client that comes and asks those questions, even if they leave it on the suppliers to do the work, but at least they're then in that consideration, right? So of course we want to take them further and say, no, there's more that you can do and that we can help you do. So that's the conversations I think we're having. And you're right, Ashish. I think the ones where leadership over workforce spans both the full-time and the contingent spaces are a little bit ahead of this curve. They're thinking a little bit more in terms of, capturing this data, in terms of making, the underrepresentation corrected and things like that, versus those that are just separately thinking about contingent and those that are separately thinking about full-time. So they're a little bit behind. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine in APAC, because some of our clients there are asking about these questions, and they're coming to us to say, well, you in the North American markets have moved a little bit further. Let's talk about what has worked and how we can bring some of that learnings into the APAC. So back to your point, Pam, I think that influence that we can have is sometimes beyond what we can work within just our client space. We can actually take that much broader, and we're doing exactly that in some cases.
I think knitting a couple of things together here. So one, I think our customers that are thinking about the contingent to perm pipeline, especially when you're looking at diversity data, knowing that that is a talent pool. And when you have better integration between procurement and HR, because HR or DEI are the ones typically looking at measurement and setting those diversity goals or your overall talent goals in general. And if you're looking at your contingent workforce as a significant and contributing part, as they should, that influences the overall metrics and the overall state of the organization. So I've seen situations happen where sometimes this happens through M&A or through other situations where you have convert contingent labor to perm, and then your diversity numbers are now behind where you wanted them to be because you weren't taking into account the diversity of the contingent labor workforce, or if you're going through an acquisition, kind of the same thing. And so I think it's really important that you're connecting the metrics with not just for the contingent labor, but for the overall talent strategy, because it does play a role in the goals that you're trying to set and the ambitions you want to have from a diversity perspective. But I do think, going back to your question before that, Ash, was around what's happening in the external market and what are things kind of maybe potentially pushing back on a little bit. The biggest things that I'm hearing are around the overturning of affirmative action and some of the pressures, particularly in states like Florida, where you're limiting diversity information when you're making decisions around hiring, et cetera. And I think that does go back to your point, Ash, around merit. Absolutely. We're hiring because people are qualified for the right role. But I think a lot of organizations are starting to think about, how do we make sure we're taking into account the diversity of our workforce without using that in a way that's going to potentially, as the implications happen within further legislation. We're seeing situations where some organizations that give out funding to Black founders or female founders, they're now getting sued because they're being prioritized because those are diverse populations. And so I think we are all looking at a landscape where this could be changing and impacting the corporate environment sooner rather than later. And we need to be prepared, and we need to be prepared for ourselves and for our customers. And the same thing is around learning and training. We're seeing diversity programs being made illegal, basically, where you're not allowed to train people on certain things. And it's, again, when you're a global organization, you're operating in multiple different countries and states, it's really challenging to keep up at this rate with the amount of change that's happening. And so going back to the very first part of the conversation, right, it's about you as your organization, what your values are, your commitments, and making sure you're surrounding yourself with legal, external experts and others that can help make sure that you are working within the confines of we don't have a lot of control over, but at the same time, making sure you stay true to your values and don't roll back any of the progress many of us have made over the past few years, especially. So I think that's something that's, I don't want to say it's keeping me up at night, but it's definitely top of mind.
I love your passion on this. And I agree with you. I think one of the things I talked about in the beginning was the genie's out of the bottle. And so if you look at what corporate America is doing versus the public policy, they're at odds with each other, right? Because corporate America, as much as they're worried about the liability, they still take risks to sort of do what's best for the business. And I'm seeing that they're doubling down on training, they're doubling down on attracting talent. And the reason is not because it's altruistic, it's actually because the demographics are telling you that. Like, I can't find talent, I can't find enough talent as it is. We've laid off 1 million people this year, and yet the unemployment rate hasn't moved at all, which tells you that we don't have enough population. So if we don't take this seriously, you're just not gonna be able to compete as a business. And so I think even if public policy changes to an effort where they're trying to dissuade us from doing these things, I don't think companies are going to stop doing them because they ultimately need to hire talent. That's my
I agree. And I think it's just working within the constraints of what is actually legal and what's not. And particularly when Roe was overturned, we spent a lot of time with our council just talking through and making sure we were clear that we were committed to our values, but we have an organization to run and we have to be staying true to that, the confines of what we have to work in. And we were able to find an effective solution, but that's why I think those partnerships are really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know Doug really well, works with Dan, and he won't take on a client that doesn't align with their values. And I think that's what you're going to see we're in a market where the economy is still strong. And I think companies are going to make decisions and based on what they believe in and not necessarily just chasing the dollar,
I think it comes back down to, like, again, I'm just stuck on the squeaky wheel today, so bear with me. It's like every organization is powered by multiple things. I think people are one of the main powers behind an organization, right? People get things done. And so if companies really want to prioritize or understand what's important, I think they should look at what is the effect of investing in the D&I strategy and how does that fulfill their own missions? Do you want to be employer of choice, which should turn into more productivity for your organization? Then that's another, business case for why you should prioritize D&I. I think where my head's at coming into this stream is we've talked about diversity and inclusion for a lot. We should continue talking about it. But I think now it's time to think about making, from intent to action. But it's not going to be 0 to 60. It's going to be, okay, if I want to take actions, how do I start? And we have to recognize that these companies are huge. They have a lot of things going on. I think diversity should be one of the top priorities, but let's give them a path of how to actually make it a priority. Why is it important? What are the benefits of making it a priority? And then that builds that sort of internal business case to bring more people along, to make it more comfortable to talk about it because it becomes more of a, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, to we should do this because it's really good for our business and it's the right thing to do. And At the end of the day, companies always want what's good for their business first. I mean, that's reality unless you're a nonprofit. Even nonprofits need to cover their costs. So tie it to the productivity of a company, tie it to the company's objectives, show how it actually fulfills the bigger initiative for the organization. And I think that's how you sort of bubble up D&I initiatives to the top and make it a priority. I think it's all about prioritization. That's all I've learned. I mean, I haven't been in the workforce that long, but I know that every quarter or half a year, every organization goes through prioritization efforts. So get it on the prioritization effort and try to put some stuff behind it and get people moving behind the initiative instead of just saying, we made a pledge to diversity and inclusion. Don't stop there. Like I feel like we're sort of stuck there.
You're trying to make yourself look young. You said you haven't been in the workforce that long.
Make sure that people don't think I don't know everything. Look, I don't know how to solve for this. I'm just trying to come up with different ways to like move it slowly forward because I want to see change. I don't know. We've been on these live streams. This is what, the third or fourth one we're doing together?
Yeah. No, but I think what you're saying is, like, I love what you're saying because we can't solve this just by like saying this needs to be done and this is how we get it done. We have to look at the small wins, right? It's just like if I want to change a relationship with my significant other, I'm not going to expect that to happen after one conversation. Like we have to play the long game on this stuff. And so I think for impact, you can't, like people say we're not getting enough done in DEI. Well, yes, it's probably not the pace you want to get it done, but if you're measuring it and you're showing progress year over year, then I think that's a successful plan.
Yeah.
We have to reward that.
Progress daily, right?
Yeah.
So another thought in that is we talk and we give a lot of opinions, as you can tell by this group, right? We tell people a lot of things that they could be doing differently. But I think there's a couple of key questions to ask. One is, what is the culture of the organization for whoever we're talking to in the conversation we're in? Who are they? Do they know who they are as an organization? Because we all know, Patrick Lencioni said this, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So if DE&I is a strategy, how is that aligned with the culture of the organization? And let's bubble it up to the culture conversation. And as part of the culture, are there core values like respect and authenticity and things that we've talked about that really, and empathy, where you really, when you drive up that conversation around diversity, equity, or inclusion, they sit in some of those core behaviors and values. But I think it's not just about what we're saying, that we focus on culture, but that we start thinking, what are the better questions we can ask of each other in these conversations, and then get that diversity of thought. And I think that's a way that we could look, as we look at 2024 and beyond. I mean, one question I would love to ask and have answered in the conversations I'm in is, when you put yourself forward in 2030, where do you see your organization? And what are the steps you wish you took today to be there?
I love that. Michelle, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think the part about making the change slowly and incrementally is extremely important. I think this isn't a new business that you just kick off and you expect that in 2 years' time you're going to see the profits roll or whatever. I think it's incremental, it's slow, and it pivots. It keeps changing as well because of what goes on in the industry or in the world or within your own company. There are certain events or laws, as we just talked about. So I think just making room for that, talking about this continuously as one of the things that leaders, middle management, talent, that we all understand now that it's important. We just need to make sure that it stays on track as we do other things for our business, which, as someone said earlier, this shouldn't be just the right thing to do. It should be necessary for us to stay in business, to stay attractive, to stay solid with our own employees, as well as for new clients and new talent. And I think the only other thought that I have in this area would be that, things can get uncomfortable. And we talk about things that are uncomfortable all the time in personal lives or in casual conversations. Why is it that when we talk about this topic that everyone starts to get a little bit, uncomfortable? So I think we need to change that. Like, let's not be so serious about it all the time. I mean, it is a serious thing, and don't take that away for a moment, but let's not make it so uncomfortable that no one knows how to talk about it or wants to talk about it or want to stay away from it. Let's make it something that we can all grow in together and bring people into the conversation, because I think that's when we'll make more steady progress.
It's funny, you reminded me that I did this training last year for a client, and they're very uncomfortable about talking about diversity and inclusion in their sales process, and they're asking me how to do that. And so I was on stage and I was like, if you talk about diversity like this, it's going to be awkward, no matter who you are, whether you're white, black, or brown. So I'm like, you have to normalize a good discussion. If you normalize discussion, your passion comes out, and no one has a monopoly on inclusion. And so I think it's very important that we speak about it as a normal thing and not as us against them or me against we, So
yeah, I've gone into some prospect or client conversations and said, I know you didn't ask us about this, but I'm here, and so I'm going to talk about it, and let's do that together. So, just kind of making it a little bit more easier to get into, so that then we can understand that, yes, this is important to us. So let's do something about it.
Yeah. Now there's we only have a few minutes left, I think, but I want to end it with what the discussion that one we'll have to define, because some of the audience doesn't know about this, but can somebody explain what co-employment is? And then number two, how is it a barrier to DEI and contingent workforce? And then number three, is that risk that co-employment has, which the largest person with the pocketbook, which is usually the end client, owns that risk no matter what, but the policies are creating, does that create systemic risk for discrimination that's probably a bigger economic risk than the co-employment risk that they're trying to manage? Does anyone want to take that on to start with?
There's a lot of questions in a row there, Ash.
I know, totally. That's why I'm leaving the last 13 minutes around this.
I think co-employment is a real thing. I think we should not say it doesn't exist. I think the context of co-employment is what's the flaw. Like, there's a shared employment responsibility when you engage with people. If you're going through a staffing supplier and that person's showing up at a client site, there is a shared management around that individual, which could turn into like a co-employment thing. As far as collecting information about the workers, the employer of record, usually the staffing suppliers, is already collecting a lot of this information around diversity and inclusion. They're probably doing the EEOC survey when they onboard somebody as an employer of the organization, because they have to meet their own mandates. The gap is that the companies that are leveraging the contingent workers are not under the same constraints, I would say, to say, like, are you collecting EEOC information on your non-employees? Because it's usually an employee thing. Also, it's sensitive data. So if the end client wants to collect this data, then you get into all these things around, well, who has access to it? Who's using it for what purpose? Could it be used in a bad way? Meaning, if somebody's making decisions around hiring, are they taking a look at the diversity panel of the person? Probably shouldn't do that. So I think co-employment to me isn't really the barrier to the diversity information collection. It's more of the whole package. It's like, well, as a company, do we have the goal of increasing diversity and inclusion? Do we recognize that if we have a goal and our organization is about 50% contractors, we've seen that number talked about a lot. Let's say a company uses 20, 30, 40% of their workforce is non-employee. Well, if you want to build an inclusive environment, you really have to count those people in your metrics, because they show up in your halls every day. They walk the halls, they sit in desks, they're in the meetings, they're on the Zooms. They are providing an impact to how people feel working in your org, whether they're an employee or not. So co-employment's I guess a convenient way of saying, well, we can't do that right now because co-employment's still in front of us. Okay, well, let's think about that. Your suppliers are collecting that information. Asking for it from suppliers can be one path. I think that is what companies are looking for today. I think that's what they've tried. But I think I don't know, co-employment doesn't, to me, act as a major barrier. I think it's a convenient excuse for slowing down the diversity aspect. And I'm not saying that all companies are doing this. I'm just saying, again, priorities, right? If a company goes up and says, we have 5 things to get done this year, and somebody shows up and says, we should further DE&I efforts, and somebody is like, well, we got to solve for co-employment, we got to solve for data collection, we got to solve for all this stuff, it becomes complicated and it becomes less tenable, and it goes down on the prioritization list of organizations. Because I believe that most companies do want to further diversity efforts. I do. I don't think there's any company that is like, we don't care about diversity. I think everybody cares about it. But again, it comes down to how tenable is the task? What risk does it put the company in to approach that task? And companies are always looking for that balance of, I'll do it if it's in a way that is easy or less risky for me to further. So is co-employment used as a barrier? Sure, it is. Is it like a non-starter? I don't think so. I think there's ways around the concept of co-employment because these workers are showing up in your locations every day. Instead of the clients asking for this information directly, there could be ways of leveraging the ecosystem, right? Having your suppliers do more, having your platform, your workforce platform do more. I don't know. There's lots of ways I think that we could solve for that. Mm-hmm. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to throw one more thing onto that. So let's take tenure limits, which is part of the reason co-employment, like part of the way to decide co-employment risk or reduce it theoretically is to create these tenure limits, right? But then if you're trying to look at monetizing or making the most productivity out of each employee in your workforce, Christina mentioned neurodiverse candidates, right? They want security, they want longevity. If you give them those two things and remove that quote unquote risk, you'll get better ROI on that than cycling them out.
Can I say one thing to sort of disagree, agree with you?
Sure.
I don't think the tenure limits were actually created for co-employment. Actually, tenure limits, I was on the client side, so this is just my experience. Yeah. I was in 4 programs, so this is just my experience. Okay, I'm certainly not saying this is true everywhere. Yeah. I think the tenure policies were in place because companies recognize the high cost of using contractors. And so when the priority was to reduce costs, and I lived through, like I think most of us lived through the 2007, 2009 sort of world, right, where the sky was falling, companies were like, how do we reduce costs? And they started saying, well, we're using all of these contractors. Again, contractors did not make up as much of a population as they do today. So back then, contractors were looked at as sort of like an expendable population. And so there was less fear of imposing restrictions on that population companies didn't worry about imposing restrictions. So they implemented tenure policies, in my opinion, to say, let's not have people remain contractors forever because we're paying a premium on those people. If you need that person long term, convert them to an employee. And so that, to me, in my experience, that's how those tenure limits came into place. I do think they're being used today as in the peripheral of diversity inclusion to that stuff. But I'm just trying to make the point that when a company sees an objective, we need to reduce costs. They get it done, and tenure limits are one reason for that. So that's my point about setting priorities and trying to bubble it up to the top. Because if companies see it being important and they see the reason why it's important to do something, but they do it.
No, those are great points. And see, this is diversity of thought, which is exactly what we're trying to get to, right? And that's how you get to the best solution. So I'm glad that we're debating this. Anyone else want to add to that?
I wasn't debating you. I'm just.
No, but you're bringing up a good topic, and it's educating everybody because we're talking about it in a different way. And your point is totally correct. Like part of it is to sort of make sure people aren't working forever as a contractor getting paid above market. If that needed in the organization, we need to make a budget for it and hire them direct at some point.
And
so
you're seeing
that discussion.
And again, this is not a tenure policy discussion. You are seeing that change, right? Companies are saying we need to retain talent, and so that pressure of the shortage of talent and having people be able to freely move around has caused companies to rethink tenure policies. They're like, should we get rid of people after 12 months just because they're a contractor? And that has changed. So it's an ever evolving system to manage people.
The only thing that I'll add on the tenure limits, it's kind of pivoting slightly, but is when we're working so hard to recruit diverse individuals, opening pipelines of talent, making sure all those doors are open, going through that process, the hiring process, and trying to debug and debias those processes, we get them in the role. Then 12 months later, we need to do that all again, right? Unlike on the full-time side, when we've done that and we hope to retain them indefinitely, right? That's the goal. That doesn't obviously happen, but your goal is to have them there forever. And you've done all of that work to get them in. You're planning on keeping them. If you're doing that on the contingent side, you're kind of on this wheel and it's continuously needing to redo. And I know we found that with some of our amazing clients that we're partnering with on this, that we get to that place of we've been doing this for a year, we've collected data, we've created a strategy, we see progress. And in the contingent workforce, having done this on the full-time side for so long, 1% increases, 2% increases, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really great work that we're doing. On the contingent side, you can see a 5% increase. You can see a 10% increase. And when I first transitioned to the contingent workforce side, I was kind of overwhelmed at that, being able to see that rate of change. But what that means is we can also change the other way very, very quickly. So you're always having to chase these goals. So really rethinking or understanding the impacts, whatever those may be. There's positive ones and I'm sure negative ones as well. Understanding the impacts of tenure limits is really critical for DE&I and many other areas.
Absolutely. So we usually end we call these microprogressions, little action steps you can take within an organization that will help you change the culture over the long term. But I want to change that a little bit today. I want to end this with, we've talked about the importance of DEI, the impact, how do we make it go from intent to action? So I'd like each of you to sort of leave what you hope the audience leaves with in terms of thoughts, or what you want them to remember from this LinkedIn Live today. So Christine, I'd like to start with you if that's okay.
I know you're going to call on me first.
Well, you left and came back.
I think the takeaways for me are, really having a plan that can be actionable, measurable, starting with the data, like Rebecca has said. It's something that, I find that a lot of organizations, ours as well as our clients, have started adopting a few years ago, is that shadow board to get that diversity of thought and that diversity of perspective, having like the younger, usually the workforce, be interacting with the executives. And I think we could take that a step farther and have like the retirees, that are coming back into the workforce with the like Gen Zers, with the executives. That really broadens not only like who's in the room and what they're hearing, but broadens our perspective and our diversity of thought, so that we can kind of continue. We said debate, not debate, but truly to kind of have like really well-rounded conversations and to talk about why it's important and how to get there, and just have kind of all cylinders firing of what will work and how will it impact like their own, micro group within the organization. And also then aligning that back to the company's culture, like Anne spoke about. And I absolutely love that Doug and Beeline don't do business with companies that don't align with their cultural values. I think that most companies should do that.
I love that. Who wants to go next?
I should be able to call on someone.
You can call on somebody.
All right. Anne.
I'm ready. No, it's okay. I think the one takeaway for me, and that's really helped me stay relevant, is just to continue to be learning. Keep your ear to the ground. There's so many free resources. It doesn't take long to listen to a podcast, to read a quick article. And every day I just try to do something that's expanding what I'm looking at day in, day out, because it makes you more relevant with your candidates, more relevant with your customers, with your stakeholders, whoever they are. And so my piece of encouragement is just continue to learn and try to do something small. You talk about micro progressions or micro actions, and you can absorb it into something you're already doing. If you're doing a load of laundry, like as a mom, I do many, or cooking dinner or going for a walk or sitting in the car, just find something that kind of keeps that top of mind, because the world's changing really fast. And I find that those little nuggets of things really make a difference when you're engaging with your different stakeholders.
So you're saying to just be curious.
Sure, absolutely. I'm stealing your T-shirt, Ashish.
Who are you going to call on next?
Rebecca.
Somehow I knew you were going to call on me. I don't know why. So actually, Ashish, you just took what I was going to say, because I was going to add on to Anne's and say, be curious, right? That this is about being open-minded, being curious. But I'm going to kind of switch it then to another piece that I talk about a lot, about making this approachable, and is kind of my philosophy with DE&I, which is it's about opening doors. So I was reading just through the comments, and there was a lot of conversation in the comments about merit-based hiring. And it's about making sure those doors are open, but not just cracked, not just unlocked and one is completely open and there's a red carpet to the role, right? It's about making sure that all of those doors are open. It's a smooth path, that they're going to feel welcome, they're going to feel belonging. So really thinking about it in that way is there roadblocks? Are there walls? Is it just barely cracked? Is there really making it difficult? But we've said that door is open. So if we think about it in that way, it's not about shutting that door that was open and opening the others. It's about really making sure that all of those doors are open, and thinking about it in that way so that it can feel approachable.
Absolutely. I love that.
And I'll call on Cassandra. I mean, I think we're at time, but if we're continuing.
Yes.
Awesome. So the one takeaway or leave behind for me is that as the industry ebbs and flows, right, our leadership is always measured on emotional intelligence, right? The resilience, how to respond. And so as you look to push forward with DE&I initiatives, it should not only encompass the emotional intelligence, but also an aspect of cultural intelligence. Doing the things that need to be done, that have to be done in order to show a progression personally. Every organization is made up of humans. And so making sure that you are in touch from a humanity perspective, staying in tune with that, and making sure you meet people where they are is the measure of cultural intelligence. And by doing that, more inclusivity, more belonging, and ultimately more diversity.
I love that cultural intelligence. I'm going to use that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Who are you calling on?
Pam.
Yeah, there you go. So I'll keep it short for us, guys. My word would be accountable. Hold ourselves accountable, hold the stakeholders we work with accountable, hold our leaders accountable, hold our policymakers accountable, because at the end of the day, well done is better than well said.
I love that too. And who do you call on?
I'm calling on Dan.
All right. So for me, it's I'm gonna go back to the squeaky wheel just because I'm on that bike and I'm gonna ride it. So I think the squeaky wheel we recognize as D&I. There's lots of squeaky wheels at organizations. So my recommendation is to be the advocate for the squeaky wheel, not think about the problems that are around it. Show how important that wheel is to the organization, drive a business objective around it, get it some attention from a strategic way. Thinking about business case, measuring where you are today, bubble that up to become a prioritization of your company, and then don't get stuck in the excuses. If co-employment, which I do think co-employment has some risk to organizations, don't let co-employment be a convenient excuse to stop and get stuck. Try to find a different way around it, right? I just think to really see D&I move in organizations, you have to make it a priority for the company to understand the value of it. So focus on the surrounding objectives around, we have a D&I initiative, what's stopping us from getting there, and try to push for that.
Definitely. I love that. And Dan and I are going to be recording a podcast during CWS. So if you guys are around, definitely come by and say hi. And last but not least, Vishali, let's close it out.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to close it out by saying that, as I said, things can be uncomfortable. So I urge all of us, myself included, and all our listeners to actually go out and have a conversation with someone today. Something that's on your mind, something that you quite may not be fully clear about. Go ask that question, have a conversation, and make that kind of the start of such a habit. So I love the curiosity and the learning. I think a lot of us do that, but let's also go out and make that something of a practice with someone else. So that'll be my last point.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor with having you all here, and I hope everyone enjoyed this. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.